Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics. In this video, I'd like to follow on from my discussion on the topic of clinical care as discussed by the Alternative SAGE group of scientists and other experts yesterday and pick up on what they were saying about easing the lockdown and the advice that they would give to the government on this. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So for those who didn't see that first video, as before, I will put a link in the description below to the broadcast that went off live on Monday of this group of experts. But in terms of this particular strand of those discussions, I'd like to pick out what the science would be in terms of how do you ease the lockdowns and what do you look for in terms of when it's safe to do so. So a mathematical modeler was talking about two types of second wave because, you know, this is what we would worry about, a second wave. And it can't be said that we are definitely not going to get a second wave no matter what we do, by the way. It's really a case of what sort of second wave. So the two types of second wave that we describe is one is a flare-up and then another one would be a longer term, second wave. And the flare-up, the initial, we've eased it too quickly, bang, it's straight back up to horrendous proportions, is very sensitive to social distancing and lockdown. So social distancing and the lockdown we've had now are the sort of measures that prevent a flare-up. And longer term second wave is really down to whether or not there'd be a loss of immunity that has been built up by people who contract the virus and then recover from it, whether they've known that's happened or not. Because there is now every reason to believe that if you contract the coronavirus and you recover, actually I suppose whether you recover or not, you then basically become immune to it. But it's nicer to think that you would recover and become immune to it, because then you'd still be breathing. So tracing and tracking are absolutely vital for dealing with the longer term second wave, for suppressing it, if not being able to eliminate it altogether. And what they talked about, well, one person talked about, was the possibility, for example, of colour-coded forecasts on the news. It said just like you have the weather forecast, you could have a forecast for the virus in terms of the behaviour you'd have to adopt, and people would need to be warned about, today or the next day we need you to be able to do this, and then maybe after a few days okay, you can rein back on that aspect of your behaviour, and maybe we need those sort of notifications. And the problem is, of course, that getting the public to adopt those sort of behaviours according to what's necessary depends on, as they said, the government being open, honest and clear about the strategy. Now, they didn't go any further with that. I will. This is not really what the government have been doing so far, and it doesn't seem like, based on what's been going on today in Parliament as I do this, it would be yesterday from your point of view, that they are keen to do that. Then there was a bit of a discussion about, would there be a loss of immunity? Now, it had to be said at the time, they're saying there is no evidence that there will be over time a loss of immunity. But it is just one of those things you might have to consider because we don't know. If you develop immunity as a result of contracting it or as a result of a vaccine, is there over time a degradation in that immunity? Because that would impact the mathematical model, because this is what this person talked about. If you create a mathematical model, you need this sort of data in order to be able to do it reliably. And in terms of this assessment of immunity, that would put more pressure on antibody testing. Remember the test that the government wanted to put in place for the immunity passport, which would test whether or not you'd come into contact with it and developed immunity by looking for antibodies. Now, if there are tests that are reliably sensitive, then we need that data ASAP, is what they're saying. Because we need to know the proportion of the population that are, as it's termed, non-susceptible, in order to model the risk of a flare-up wave, because that's what you absolutely want to avoid, a flare-up wave. The longer-term second wave, suppress it, but you don't want a flare-up wave. And someone was suggesting that there was a model that was suggesting that as much as 50% of the population may well have already become infected, and if that's the case, then it would be optimistic. That would be a really good outcome. But it was pointed out that this Oxford model, in fact I've talked about this one before a few weeks ago, is not widely accepted. It is a model that sort of predicts this, but it's not, generally speaking, amongst the scientific community, I've known from reading various things, there's a lot of people suggesting this is not the case, and it's certainly not in line with what other countries are experiencing as well. Other studies talk about much, much lower figures. And it's worth remembering that a model is only as good as the parameters and the data fed into it. As we have less data than we could have had, and no country at all has the data that they would like, but the figures will get close to fact only with more data. And in fact, they're talking just recently, I was reading a statistician's discussion in the British Medical Journal, which I may well do a separate video on, just saying that the data in the UK at the moment is worthless for this. We are just randomly throwing numbers into these models for the UK because we're not collecting the data that's needed. And there were others who were also concerned about people outside of scientific circles seizing on certain figures or phrases that could be discussed speculatively, because this is sometimes the problem when you talk about the results of a particular model. Those who are not scientifically minded, untrained, can draw the wrong conclusions, and we've seen this in the press when the press run with something like this as well. And it was also pointed out that even when a vaccine is available, because obviously what we've got to talk about and what they were very much talking about is we can't wait for the vaccine to ease out of lockdown. You can't. So there was an understanding amongst the group that what we need to do is to provide some advice to the government that says, what do we do to ease out of the lockdown while we are waiting for the vaccine? And then it's a different mode of living once the vaccine is here. But it doesn't matter even when the vaccine is available. It doesn't mean we've beaten it in terms of looking at the future, because a vaccine affects, well, it depends on the effectiveness of the vaccine itself, but it also depends on uptake. Enough people being vaccinated. And that's not just a time factor in terms of getting the population vaccinated. It's also a willingness on the part of the population to be vaccinated. So in the absence of knowing, there's huge gaps in our knowledge. And in the absence of reliable data, what you actually have to do, instead of knowing the situation and then planning for that situation, what you have to do is you have to think, right, we don't know the situation. So then you have to plan for various scenarios. You have to plan for, okay, so what if 50% of the population had come into contact with it? But then what if it's only as low as 10%, which actually seems to be more realistic, according to the scientific community. And the point was made that we have to keep R below 1. So R is the growth rate. So any one time the growth rate is, at the moment, 0 point something. It needs to be kept quite low because due to the exponential nature of it, it was noted, if it even goes a little bit above 1, then it will just spiral out of control. So what happened in Germany, I think, the figure's right, I think when Germany decided to ease a few restrictions, theirs was about 0.5-ish, and I think it went up to about 0.8 or something like that, which indicated that the growth rate had increased as a result of easing those measures. And it's not a case, when I say something like that, bear in mind, if you keep it below 1, it's okay. It's not. Like, you want to keep it well below 1. You can't have it at 0. That's not happening. The lower it is, the better. But even anything above 0 means that more people are becoming infected, and statistically some of those people will end up dying. So the higher that R value goes, the more, think of it this time, the more people are dying. But if you get it above 1, then that's when you lose control. And problems with getting the data as well, the data that is useful. And one recommendation that came from the group would be the need to get better quality data, because at the moment, as I've said before, the data is considered worthless, and there is even a question about, can we even get back to where we were at the start before all that herd immunity strategy nonsense came in? At the start, where we have a find, test, trace strategy. In that case, we can then get the economy moving while we wait for a vaccination program, because everyone was fully on board with the notion we need to get the economy working again, and for that you need some sort of strategy to manage the situation while we wait for a vaccine. And it seemed to also be agreed that we're not going to eradicate this virus. There's no belief that we're ever going to eradicate it. It's about suppressing it. And then there was an interesting discussion on, why it was that we're not taking advantage of being an island nation. That gives us a huge advantage. It limits the places into which people can come into the country. And they were talking about the need to improve port health, and have to remind people that the UK has not been carrying out any checks at our ports. I was astounded at the start of this process. We know other countries, doing the temperature measurements on people coming through airports. We weren't. And as far as I knew, we were doing. I don't know. I'd not said anything, but I don't go to airports. I wouldn't know. But apparently we're not. We're still not doing that. And, even when other European countries were closing their borders, we were not even checking people coming through our wide open border with so much as a forehead thermometer. And it was pointed out that this isn't because it's new. There's a lot of people try and defend the government by saying, oh, but this is all new. It's not new. It is not new. Even coronavirus isn't new. And, this pandemic is new. What's causing it is not. And, but what has been pointed out is this idea of port health, checking people coming through your ports, is just part of infection control. It's standard. In fact, we know it's standard. You will have seen it with past pandemics, which were not as serious as this one. It is nothing new. The only new thing about it is that we're not doing it, because we have done it in past. In the past, we've done this. We're not now. Other people are. We're not now. And we had that advantage as an island. It's part of what meant that we had much more time than others, but we also had an easier job than those who were on a continent to suppress this from the start, and we didn't take advantage of it, and we're still not taking advantage of it. So those are the points I pulled out from that anyway. So those are the two main threads I thought were really interesting: the clinical care aspects, which I discussed yesterday, and the science of what's needed to be done to ease the lockdown. And ultimately it comes down to get better data. We have the capacity to do it. Get it. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, and if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. Until next time, I'll see you later.